In the spring of 1970, the war in Vietnam was raging.
American battle deaths in Vietnam now number 40,142.
And at home, anti-war protesters and law enforcement officers were violently clashing.
It felt like a nightmare was unfolding. I took what was outrage and horror about what was going on, and I realized that I had to take it somewhere.
Bonnie Raines worked at a daycare center in Philadelphia. Her husband John taught religion at Temple University. They were the very picture of a golden couple.
We had an 8-year-old, a 6-year-old, and a 2-year-old. We were family folks who also wanted to keep another track active in our lives, which was political activism.
That activism attracted the attention of the FBI. Its director, the powerful and feared J. Edgar Hoover, perceived the anti-war movement, which ranged from radical revolutionaries to peaceful protesters, as a threat to national security.
At one rally, I had one of my children on my back, and not only did they take my picture, but they took her picture.
Protesters like the Raines became increasingly convinced the FBI was conducting a covert campaign against them, tapping their phones and infiltrating anti-war groups.
We knew the FBI was systematically trying to squash dissent, and dissent is the lifeblood of democracy.
Determined to get proof the FBI was crossing the line, fellow activist and Haverford physics professor William Davidon hatched a plan. He reached out to the Raines and 6 others, including a social worker, a graduate student, and a taxi driver named Keith Forsyth.
We agreed to meet someplace where we could talk. And he says, what would you think about the idea of breaking into an FBI office? And I look at him, and I'm like, you're serious, aren't you? I was pretty vehement in my opposition to the war, and I felt like marching up and down the street with a sign was not cutting it anymore. And it was like, okay, time to kick it up a notch.
The crew decided to break into a small FBI field office in Media, Pennsylvania.
Once I got over the shock of thinking that this was the nuttiest thing I'd ever heard in my life, I'm like, this is a great idea, because we're not going to make any allegations. We're going to take their own paperwork signed by their own people, including J. Edgar Hoover, and give it to the newspapers. So let's see you argue with that.
In the Raines' third-floor attic, the team divvied up responsibilities and assigned tasks. They hung maps to learn about the neighborhood, planned escape routes, and they took extensive notes on the comings and goings in the building.
I signed up for a correspondence course in locksmithing. That was my job, to get us in the door. Practice several times a week. After a month, you get pretty good.
Bonnie was assigned the job of going inside and casing the office.
I was to call the office and make an appointment as a Swarthmore student, doing research on opportunities for women in the FBI. So they gave me an appointment. I tried to disguise myself as best I could, and I went to say goodbye, and I acted confused about where the door was, and that gave me a chance then to check out both rooms and know where the file cabinets were.
Bonnie discovered there was no alarm system and no security guards. She also found a second door leading inside.
When she came back with that news, we became convinced, yes, I think we can get this done. We had more to lose than anybody else in the group because we had these kids.
We faced the reality of if we were arrested and on trial, we would be in prison for very many years. We had to make some plans for that.
With a solid understanding of how they would conduct the break-in, they now needed to figure out when.
March 8, 1971, Fraser and Ali were fighting for the championship of the world. And we had the feeling that maybe the cops might be a little bit distracted.
While the crew waited at a nearby hotel, Forsyth arrived at the office alone.
Pull up, walk up to the door, and one of the locks is a cylinder tumbler lock, not a pin tumbler lock. And I just about had a heart attack. Bottom line is I could not pick that lock.
They almost called it off, but that second door that Bonnie noticed gave them another chance.
At that point, you know that you're going to have to wing it. Knelt down on the floor, picked the lock in like 20 seconds. There was a deadbolt on the other side. I had a pry bar with me, a short crowbar. I put the bar in there and yank that sucker. At one point, I heard a noise inside the office, and I'm like, are they in there waiting for me? Basically said to myself, there's only one way to find out. I'm going in.
Next, the inside crew walked into an empty office wearing business suits and carrying several suitcases. They cleaned out file cabinets and then made their way downstairs to the getaway car and drove off unnoticed. The group reconvened at a farmhouse an hour's drive away and started unpacking.
We were like, oh man, I can't believe this worked. We knew there was going to be some gold in there somewhere.
Each of the 8 of us were sorting files, and all of a sudden you'd hear one of them, oh, look at this one, look.
After several long nights digging for documents that looked the most revealing, the burglars sent copies to journalists, including Washington Post reporter Betty Medsger.
The cover letter was from the Citizens Commission to investigate the FBI, and the first file that I read was about a group of FBI agents who were told to enhance the paranoia in the anti-war movement and to create an atmosphere that there's an FBI agent behind every mailbox.
Attorney General John Mitchell asked the Post not to write about the stolen documents, saying it could endanger lives.
The Attorney General called 2 key editors and tried to convince them not to publish.
But the Post did publish the story on the front page. It was the first of several reports and told how agents turned local police, letter carriers, and switchboard operators into informants.
There were very strong editorials calling for an investigation of the FBI.
Another stolen document would prove even more explosive. A routing slip marked with a mysterious word, COINTELPRO. While reporters tried to uncover its meaning, the FBI was desperate to find the burglars. The Bureau put nearly 200 agents on the investigation. Hoover's best lead was the college girl who had visited their office.
His command was, find me that woman.
Agents actively searched for Bonnie, but there were many anti-war activists who fit her description.
We could hide within thousands of people. There were so many of us who were active.
The documents prove...
2 years later, NBC reporter Carl Stern figured out the meaning of that word, COINTELPRO.
Secret FBI memos made public today show that the late J. Edgar Hoover ordered a nationwide campaign to disrupt the activities of the New Left without telling any of his superiors about it.
Many of the techniques were clearly illegal. Burglaries, forged blackmail letters, and threats of violence were used.
The FBI initially defended its actions.
The government would have been derelict in its duty had it not taken measures to protect the fabric of our society.
But the Bureau's techniques were worse and the targets more far-reaching than the burglars ever imagined.
Diplomats, government employees, sports figures, socially prominent persons, senators, and congressmen.
The FBI at one time sought to blackmail the late Martin Luther King into committing suicide.
Marriages were destroyed, violence was encouraged, many Americans were tapped and bugged, had their mail opened by the CIA and the FBI, and their tax returns used illegally.
Congress issued a series of reforms. When William Webster took over the FBI in 1978, his mandate was clear.
My primary focus was making clear that COINTELPRO was no longer one of the arrows in the quiver of the FBI, that we were out of that business forever.
Webster admits the Bureau's tactics were out of bounds, but does not condone what the activists did to reveal them.
You can say the information might be useful, but the method is hardly justifiable. There's a way to take on the unjust law in the courts and deal with it in that way.
You know, there were things happening that were flat out wrong. Ordinary, how you treat your fellow man, wrong. And we took a risk to try to do what we could to put a stop to it.
The burglars were never caught. 5 years later, with the statute of limitations running out, the FBI closed the case, unsolved.
On the very last memo where they say who they think broke into the media office, they're down to 7 people. Only